Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise tonight in our adjournment proceedings to revisit a question that I asked on May 29th of this year. To read it now is not only to have deja vu, and I'm certainly not going to ever say I told you so, Mr. Speaker, but it's really a rather interesting exchange. On May 29th, I asked what the Government of Canada was thinking, and I put it this way. The Government of Canada apparently just bought a pipeline for Kinder Morgan for $4.5 billion. I mentioned that Kinder Morgan had paid $550 million for it, but the main point of my question was there are 15 different court cases right now that have not yet been resolved, and, quote, when the Federal Court of Appeal rules, if the court rules that the permits are invalid, what is the government's plan? The response came from the then Minister of Natural Resources, who was quite certain that my question was entirely hypothetical, and looking at the history of what the government had actually done, he said, quote, we do know that through this process there was unprecedented consultation with Indigenous peoples. Well, what we now do know is that government should have paid a bit more attention to the risks that they were taking with public funds for a project that was still before the courts and which had not yet been found to be in possession of valid permits. We now know those permits were invalid and that the consultation with Indigenous peoples violated the Constitution. So the real question now for tonight's adjournment proceedings is why on earth did the Government of Canada persist and continue the purchase of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, the 65-year-old Trans Mountain pipeline, for $4.5 billion? The court case to which I referred in adjournment proceedings in May, rather in the question period in May, was quashed. All the permits were quashed on August 30th. And it was less than 24 hours later, on August 31st, that the Government of Canada proceeded to hand a check for $4.5 billion over to Kinder Morgan. Now, some might think, well, they had to. They have a contract of purchase and sale. But, Mr. Speaker, I went through that contract of purchase and sale carefully. There was no closing date. There was something called the outside date, by which if we didn't finish the contract, we didn't provide the money, the whole contract would have been null and void. That outside date was December 31st, 2018, a date that has not yet arrived. There was no reason in law, contract law or otherwise, to give Kinder Morgan a check for $4.5 billion for a 65-year-old pipeline, the purchase of which did not create a single additional Canadian job, did not bring any wealth to Canada, in fact, for which we vastly overpaid. Why did the Government of Canada go ahead and give that check on August 31st? Particularly, and this is significant, Mr. Speaker, had the government lawyers spent some time reviewing the Federal Court of Appeal case, it's very clear that the court found that not only did the Government of Canada violate Indigenous rights, so too did Kinder Morgan. So as a matter of contract law, with the fundamental breach of all the conditions that were in place when the Government of Canada recklessly, foolishly, hypocritically, given a commitment to end fossil fuel subsidies, offered up $4.5 billion, why did we not study the Federal Court of Appeal case and get out of the purchase of a 65-year-old pipeline? And to this day, especially given the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we must immediately reduce our emissions, why are we still thinking that we should spend $10 billion more to expand the pipeline?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands for her question. It gives me the opportunity to remind Canadians how we got to where we are with Trans Mountain, and we'd like to inform them of what we intend to do. We intend to invest in the future of Canada, in something that will create good jobs, provide access to new markets internationally, and make sure that Canada gets a fair price on the world market when it sells its precious resource. These are the reasons why we approved this project after having studied it very carefully and consulting with the public and the broadest consultations with Indigenous people ever for any project. We intend to improve our processes. We acted with good faith. I would also observe that we have improved our efforts in two main areas. First of all, we had to consider the effect of increased maritime traffic, and secondly, the Crown had not really acquitted itself of its duty to consult Indigenous peoples.
Next, the Federal Court of Appeals decision, and we are already taking steps to follow its direction. This includes instructing the NEB to reconsider its recommendations concerning the effects of increased project-related marine shipping. As part of this process, our government will be appointing a special marine technical advisor to the NEB to ensure it has the expertise and capacity to deliver the best advice. Our government will also be presenting the NEB with detailed information on our recent actions to preserve Canada's oceans, coastal communities, and marine life. These efforts include measures to protect southern resident killer whales off the coast of British Columbia and a $1.5 billion oceans protection plan that represents the single largest investment of its kind in Canadian history. On our way forward also involves relaunching Phase 3 consultations with all 117 Indigenous groups affected by the project, and doing so in an efficient and meaningful way. This includes appointing former Supreme Court Justice, the Honourable Frank Iacobucci, as a special representative on legal and constitutional matters. Mr. Speaker, this is how we are moving forward the right way. This is how we will build a prosperous, sustainable, and inclusive future for Canadians. And this is how we will build a Canada that works for everyone. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to the Parliamentary Secretary, I could point out that there is no Oceans Protection Plan. There is an Oceans Protection Wish List. I haven't seen a plan, and $1.5 billion has been announced. We don't know how much per coast, much less how it's actually going to be spent. I could point out that the consultations with First Nations are rendered far less credible when the government continues to insist the pipeline must be built. But with my remaining 30 seconds, I would ask the Parliamentary Secretary this. Please present to the House of Commons a cost-benefit analysis of building a $10 billion expansion. Compare the number of jobs that will be created by that effort, which according to Kinder Morgan would amount to 90 permanent jobs, with the jobs that would be created if we were to refine the bitumen, upgrade it in Alberta, and use it within Canada. And please explain how buying and building new pipelines is possibly consistent with our Paris commitments.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I will repeat that the Trans Mountain Extension is an investment in Canada's future. This is why our government has confidence in this project, and we intend to go forward stage by stage. We want a balanced approach in this century of clean growth, where the economy and the environment have to go together. We want to do business that is good for us, but also intelligent.